the melancholic expression that has appeared over the last 5 to 6 years in numerous very young children in the child's countenance is little noticed by people today. If they noticed it, they would draw from it, just from this alone, the impulse and realization that a powerful social movement has to gain ground. So, we need to acquire a sense for the look, for the physiognomy that people have in the earliest years of their earthly existence. But for this to happen, people need, of course, to develop this sense. Now, no matter how grotesque it may still seem to many people, much can be done to develop this sense by engaging with what is really trying to be achieved by eurythmy. Not by merely pursuing sensation, however, but by engaging with our whole soul. You will see in a moment why this is. Someone who is in a position today to communicate through occult experience with the dead, of course one communicates with the dead through thoughts, soon notices that very many of the thoughts by which one wishes to communicate with the dead are not understood by them. Many of the thoughts of people here on earth, of the thoughts that people have grown accustomed to, sound for the dead. Naturally, you need to take this in the right way. I am talking about thought communication with the dead, like an unintelligible foreign language. And if we look closer at this situation, we find that verbs, prepositions, and particularly interjections are relatively easily understood by the dead, but nouns hardly at all. Nouns represent a kind of gap in the deceased's understanding of language. The dead never understand if we try to speak to them with a lot of nouns. And we notice that if we change a noun into a verb, the dead then begin to understand. Why is this? We come to realize that this is not due at all to the dead, but due to ourselves. It is due to the person who is speaking with the dead. And the reason is that, at least for all Central and Western European languages, it becomes more the case the farther west you go, people today, and ever since the middle of the 15th century, have lost a vivid feeling for the pictorial quality the noun expresses. When a person today utters a noun, it is something nebulous, having resonance only in our understanding. Only the smallest minority of people still think something with any reality at all when they utter a noun. When you have to change a noun into a verb, you are inwardly forced to think a bit more concretely. When someone says, in quotes, the germ, you will not find in most cases, especially when they are talking abstractly, that they have a concrete image in their mind of a plant seed germ, say of a germinating bean. Their image is something nebulous, just something in principle. When you say something is germinating, or that which germinates, you are at least forced, by using the verb form, to think of an emerging, in other words, of something that is moving. This means that you go from the abstract into the concrete. And because you yourself have moved from the abstract to the concrete, the deceased one begins to understand you. But because, for reasons I have often discussed here, the living connection between people alive on earth and the discarnate souls who have passed through the portal of death must become closer and closer, because the impulses working in from the dead must take effect on earth more and more. Because of this, people will be obliged to gradually take into their language, into their speech, and therefore also into their thinking, something that leads from the abstract to the concrete. This must become a real aspiration in people, to think pictorially, in imaginative pictures when they speak. You see, even into the 15th century, words were still connected with pictorial thoughts of this kind by everyone. This pictorial thinking was then discarded. We need to train ourselves back into it, for the deceased only understand what still reverberates in language in a pictorial way. Everything which, as is mostly the case in modern language, is no longer pictorial, is not formulated with a rich pictorial quality, so that the recipient receives a pictorial thought, is unintelligible to the dead. If you consider the matter further, you will see that whenever we convert something and give it a pictorial quality, its actual nounal nature is lost. It is all transformed into a verb quality, or at least into something where one is obliged to produce pictorial thoughts. If one develops a style today that is consistently based on pictorial thoughts, the response one gets as a rule is that people don't understand it, that it is difficult to comprehend. But anyone who takes our times seriously will strive consciously for a style that can be thought through and through in images. The facility for speaking in abstractions is pushed to its greatest extreme precisely in the present rhetoric on the social question. And people have gradually got used to accepting the words like verbal coins, as it were, with which they no longer think anything of a concrete pictorial nature at all. Just read a modern pamphlet or book on social questions. You will only manage it if you have spent years familiarizing yourself with what is meant there, for the whole meaning of such speeches is based on the conventional use of the words. When we try to find the verb behind each noun, and by way of exercise, do not always talk about light and sound, but talk about that which shines and that which sounds, then we are on a track that can be helpful in this respect. And even an adjective is far better than a noun. It is much more concrete to say, quote, people who are skillful, close quote, than simply to talk about the skilled. But, in quote, skillful person is already far more concrete than when the terrible ghost skill is uttered, for that is how the deceased experience it, as a terrible ghost. Forming thoughts by way of comparisons and relationships is something by which you advance from the abstract to the concrete, and gradually reach a point where you no longer accept abstractions, but change them into something concrete. You listen to the genius of the language. The schools today ought really to come to the aid of what is a great cultural task. Exercises should be done in schools for making thinking concrete, so that when they speak, people begin to feel themselves in their speaking, to feel themselves in the world in their speaking. Let's say, for example, I write something on the board. Someone says, "I can't grasp that." Think of the shadowy abstractions you sometimes have in your mind when you say, "I can't grasp it." They would become concrete if you imagined that you wanted to physically grasp it, to reach out and take hold of it, but you don't grasp it, you stay back, you don't reach it. But you would have to imagine this with your hands. Try this with the most important words. What would you be doing? In your mind, you would actually be doing eurythmy. When you speak concretely, in your mind, you are doing eurythmy. There would be nothing for it but to do eurythmy in your mind. And someone who is engaged in these things in a living way experiences modern people as, pardon me for saying so, awful lazybones, as people who always walk around with their hands in their pockets and don't want to move, and then speak. Experienced spiritually, when people think abstractly, they plant their feet together, thrust their hands into their pockets, and so force everything into themselves as much as possible. That's how people talk today. Leaving out concreteness in one's thoughts means being slouchy. But this is how most people are nowadays. People need to become inwardly mobile once more. This means they need to feel with the world. Even those who do this sometimes only do it unconsciously. We know people who touch their nose when they think deeply about something. The fact that this is a fully concrete eurythmic gesture for, quote, wanting to feel strong in oneself, close quote, in order to make a decision, is something people are completely unaware of. This is what we need to bear in mind if we want to look at the more intimate imperatives of human development from the present into the future. The imperative of adopting into our language what is lacking in language today. And because of this lack, the human being closes himself off from the whole world in which he finds himself between death and a new birth. This is why, when we want to establish a connection with one who has died, we are always urged not to speak to them simply in verbal concepts, for that doesn't lead very far, but to think of any concrete situation, how you stood next to them, you heard their voice. This brought you together with them in feeling. Thinking of the situation absolutely concretely and everything that happened, this is what connects us with one who has died. For people today use language in a way that separates them from the world of the dead. The genius of language has died to a large extent and has to be brought back to life. Many of the linguistic combinations and the like that people are currently used to will probably have to be dropped. A very, very great deal depends on this, my dear friends. For we will only come to imaginative, mental picturing once again, which I have already mentioned here as being imperative for our future development, by really trying to listen and learn from the genius of the language, the concrete aspect underlying words. Only then will we gradually get rid of the complicated abstraction, and something else will emerge. People today feel an enormous satisfaction when they can think in abstractions, when they get away from reality, which for them is sensory reality. But by doing so, they actually just end up in thought holes. At least for the dead, they are thought holes. And when people today talk about spirit, 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 that is also just so many thought holes, because people don't picture anything concrete. Most thoughts today are abstractions. The further eastward one goes, so the Europeans say, the more pictorial language becomes. This is precisely the reason why language is more closely related to spirit the further one goes to the east, because it is more pictorial. Speaking in abstractions ought not take us away from a thinking that is concrete and sensory, but rather should simply illuminate this thinking. But just think, have many of you thought of the concrete aspect of the sentence I have just spoken? Quote, real sensory thinking should be illuminated by abstractions, close quote. As a concrete sensory thought, you have to imagine this as dark, a darkness. This darkness is illuminated by abstractions. We can think of rays of light coming into a dark space that is blue-black, while what is shining in is yellowish. In saying, quote, abstractions illuminate our concrete sensory thoughts, close quote, I have in my mind a dark space into which bright rays of light are shining. See illustration. How many people today really have a picture like this in their mind? They say the word illuminate without having a concrete image any more in what we call the mind's eye, EYE. But what matters is not only that we imagine concrete and sensory things differently when we start using abstractions, but that we have a feeling for this different way of mental picturing. We can acquire this feeling by watching eurythmy, for what is in words comes to expression there through a different medium, one less hackneyed, through the medium of gesture, and people can find their way back to pictorial thinking. This is not mentioned here on a whim, but is something truly connected with our cultural development exceptionally strongly. It is important to understand this. We are now in the 5th post-Atlantean epoch. Ahead of us we have the 6th and 7th, and then a great juncture in human evolution. During this 5th post-Atlantean era, languages have to go back to being concrete, to pictorial thinking. Only in this way can we really fulfill the task of this 5th post-Atlantean age. Now, the more spiritual life is under the yoke of the state, the less will languages return to an image-rich thinking. The more schools and creative activities have been nationalized in the last centuries, the more abstract the whole of life has become. Only a life of thought established on its own footing will be able to bring about the necessary pictorializing of people's mental nature. And this has to be brought about. What has to develop before this fifth post-Atlantean epoch comes to an end is pictorial thinking, imagination. It is the special task of this fifth post-Atlantean epoch to develop the gift of imagination in earthly humanity. An imaginative, intellectual, and spiritual culture must develop in the future. Today we have the culmination, as it were, of an abstract culture, a culture that everywhere works toward abstractions. The culture must evolve from this, which has image-rich thoughts. Our culture will need to be permeated by something people will not be inclined to express in abstract thoughts, but in images, such as that of our group statue, with the representative of humanity in the middle, with the Luciferic principle as one pole and the Ahrimanic principle as the other pole. And many and increasingly more people will have to say to themselves, quote, "Things to do with the real life of the creative mind cannot be expressed in abstract thoughts." We should not always be asking for abstract thoughts, but it is appropriate and finds its way more deeply into the human heart and mind to express oneself in images, close quote. A pictorial, communal life is what has to emerge. If we were entirely limited to what we experience mentally, in what can be uttered from one person and another, if we could not serve one another in an unspoken way, we would be able to carry little into the world through which we live after stepping through the portal of death.